At 4:48 a.m. on January 30th, 2026, a single emergency call cut through the quiet of Los Angeles dawn, the kind of hour when the city seems to briefly forget itself, when even Hollywood feels human. There were no studio lights, no makeup mirrors, no carefully timed punchlines waiting to land. Only the distant wail of sirens and the fading breath of a woman the world believed would always be there. The official words came later, spare and almost cruel in their restraint, a brief illness, nothing more, nothing less. In that moment, millions felt the same hollow shock, the same disbelief that follows when laughter suddenly disappears from a room you assumed was safe. Just days earlier, she had seemed vibrant, sharp, unmistakably herself, a presence that carried decades of shared memory, of holiday reruns, of voices and expressions that had quietly woven themselves into the fabric of everyday life. How does someone who feels so permanent simply vanish overnight? The question lingered in the silence that followed, heavier than any headline. For generations, she had been more than a performer. She was familiarity itself, the kind of face that greeted you year after year, the kind of voice that made chaos feel manageable. She taught audiences how to laugh while holding back tears, how to find warmth in absurdity, how to survive moments of panic by leaning into humor instead of fear. That gift created an illusion of immortality, the sense that someone who could generate that much life on screen must somehow be protected from the fragility that touches everyone else. And yet, behind the carefully controlled public image, behind the discipline and professionalism that defined her career, there was always an unspoken boundary. She did not invite the world into her private battles. She did not turn pain into performance or vulnerability into spectacle. In an industry addicted to confession and collapse, her restraint was almost radical. The illness referenced so briefly in those final statements was not just a medical reality, it was the last expression of a lifetime spent guarding her inner world. Those closest to her would later speak of shock, not because they were unaware of her humanity, but because she had mastered the art of continuity so completely. She showed up, she delivered, she made it look effortless. That consistency became a promise the audience never realized it was asking her to keep. The hours after the news broke were filled with disbelief that felt deeply personal, as if a family member had been taken without warning. Messages poured in from colleagues and fans alike, all circling the same regret, the same quiet thought that there would be more time, more seasons, more cameos, more moments that felt reassuring simply because she existed in the world. The cruelty of the phrase brief illness lay in what it denied. The chance to prepare, the opportunity for a long goodbye, the space to gradually accept that even the most comforting figures are still subject to limits. Her life had been built on precision, on timing, on knowing exactly when to enter and when to exit a scene. In the end, she chose to leave without fanfare, without explanation, without allowing the machinery of fame to dissect her final days. That choice transformed her passing into something uniquely unsettling. There was no scandal to process, no villain to blame, no dramatic unraveling to analyze. Only the realization that strength and silence can coexist, that endurance often hides cost, and that the people who give us the most joy are not exempt from exhaustion. As the city woke up that morning, unaware that something fundamental had shifted, the absence became undeniable. The laughter she had provided for decades echoed louder than ever precisely because it had stopped. And in that sudden stillness, a question emerged that would not go away. If someone who seemed so alive could be gone in an instant, how many other quiet battles are being fought behind familiar smiles, behind performances we take for granted, behind the comforting illusion that some people are simply built to last? She did not arrive in Hollywood chasing attention. Long before the red carpets and standing ovations, her sense of humor was forged in a crowded, noisy household where being heard meant being quick, sharp, and resilient. Born into a large Catholic family in Toronto, laughter was not entertainment. it was survival. Dinner tables were loud, siblings competed for space, and wit became currency. In that environment, she learned an instinct that would define her entire life. Humor was a shield, a way to soften chaos and claim a moment of control. That instinct followed her into adulthood, shaping not only her performances but also her approach to pain, disappointment, and fear. While others learned to speak loudly about their struggles, she learned to disappear into work. That disappearing act was not weakness, it was discipline. It was how she stayed standing in a profession that often rewards spectacle over substance. Her formative years coincided with a brutal era of comedy, one that demanded speed, endurance, and emotional armor. When she entered the world of improvisation at Second City in the 1970s, the environment was electric but unforgiving. It was a space dominated by men, by egos, by an unspoken rule that vulnerability had no place on stage. Standing shoulder to shoulder with future legends like John Candy and Eugene Levy, she did not ask for space. She took it by outworking everyone around her. She learned to transform herself completely, to become so convincing in character that the woman underneath faded from view. That ability became her greatest strength and, quietly, her greatest habit. When audiences laughed, they were rarely laughing at Catherine herself, but at someone she had constructed with surgical precision. The applause went to the mask, and she was content to let it stay that way. As her career expanded, the public narrative simplified her into something comforting and familiar. She became the dependable presence, the one who could elevate any scene without demanding the spotlight. When Home Alone arrived, it froze her image into a cultural memory that repeated itself every year without aging. To millions, she became synonymous with safety, with family, with the promise that even in chaos, everything would work out. That association followed her relentlessly. Fame, in her case, was not noisy or scandalous. It was steady, constant, and quietly demanding. Each December, she re-entered living rooms across the world, reinforcing the illusion that she was timeless, that she belonged permanently to the present tense. Behind that familiarity, however, lived a perfectionist with relentless standards. Colleagues often described her as meticulous to the point of obsession, replaying lines, adjusting inflections, refining gestures long after others were satisfied. Comedy was not casual for her. It was engineering. She believed that laughter carried responsibility, that if an audience trusted you with their release, you owed them absolute commitment. That belief drove her to work harder than necessary, to push herself further than required, and to minimize her own discomfort in service of the performance. It also taught her to hide exhaustion behind energy, nerves behind professionalism, and fear behind preparation. Her later career only intensified these contradictions. When Schitt's Creek arrived, it did more than revive her visibility, it redefined her legacy. In her 60s, an age when many actresses are quietly sidelined, she delivered a performance that felt fearless, extravagant, and endlessly inventive. Moira Rose was not just a character, she was a declaration. The wigs, the accent, the theatricality all suggested confidence without limits. The industry applauded her reinvention, critics celebrated her bravery, and audiences assumed she had reached a place of creative invincibility. What few considered was the cost of sustaining that level of intensity at a stage of life when the body begins to demand honesty. Off camera, she remained guarded. She resisted the culture of overexposure, choosing family over visibility and absence over explanation. Long gaps between projects fueled speculation, but she never corrected the record. Some assumed she was selective. Others believed she was simply uninterested in the machinery of fame. The truth was quieter and more complex. She had watched too many peers be consumed by an industry that mistakes availability for worth. Losses within her professional family, especially the sudden death of John Candy, taught her that devotion to the show must never eclipse devotion to life itself. Yet even that lesson came with a paradox. She protected her private world fiercely, but she continued to give everything she had to her work. That tension shaped her entire existence. She fought to be present as a wife and mother while remaining indispensable as an artist. She balanced domestic normalcy against professional excellence, rarely allowing one world to intrude upon the other. The result was a life that appeared remarkably stable from the outside, almost suspiciously free of scandal. But stability is not the same as ease. It requires constant negotiation, constant restraint, constant silence. By the time whispers began circulating about her reduced appearances and sudden scheduling changes, she had already spent decades perfecting the art of not being questioned. The past, in her case, was not a series of dramatic traumas, but a long accumulation of discipline, loss, and expectation. Each success reinforced the idea that she could handle anything, that she would always show up smiling, prepared, and composed. That belief settled not only into the audience, but into the industry, and perhaps even into herself. And so the foundation was laid for what would come next, a moment when the habits that sustained her would collide with a reality they could no longer contain. The shift did not announce itself with drama. There was no collapse on a red carpet, no leaked hospital photo, no headlines screaming urgency. Instead, it arrived as a collection of small, easily dismissed changes that only made sense in retrospect. Invitations quietly declined. Appearances shortened. Commitments adjusted with polite explanations that satisfied everyone and alarmed no one. To the outside world, it looked like discretion, a veteran choosing her moments. To those closest to her, it felt different, like a subtle withdrawal that could not quite be named. She was still sharp, still generous, still unmistakably present, but the rhythm had changed. Conversations paused a fraction longer. Laughter, once effortless, occasionally arrived a second late. These were not signs of weakness so much as signs of effort, the kind that comes when the body begins to negotiate terms it once obeyed without question. In late 2025, the industry buzz around her shifted tone almost imperceptibly. Instead of speculation about her next role, there were quiet questions about her absence. Production schedules were rearranged. Public events she had always attended suddenly moved forward without her. No one panicked because no one had been given permission to worry. She had built her career on reliability, and reliability is often mistaken for resilience without limits. When colleagues asked how she was doing, the answers were gentle, reassuring, and final. She did not invite follow-up. She never had. Years of mastering performance had taught her exactly how much to reveal to keep concern at bay. Behind closed doors, however, the balance was becoming harder to maintain. The body that had carried decades of precision was beginning to resist the pace it once tolerated. Fatigue was no longer something that dissolved after rest. It lingered, followed her, demanded acknowledgement. But acknowledgement was a luxury she did not easily grant herself. To admit vulnerability felt like a betrayal of the discipline that had sustained her. She had spent a lifetime ensuring that personal discomfort never interfered with professional excellence. Now that principle worked against her, encouraging endurance when rest was needed, silence when clarity might have helped. The final weeks unfolded with an almost cruel normalcy. There were moments of warmth, of connection, of plans spoken casually, as if the future were still expansive. That is what made the aftermath so devastating. Those around her did not feel summoned to a goodbye. They felt included in continuity. She had perfected the art of reassurance so thoroughly that even those closest believed there would be time later, time to talk, time to adjust, time to slow down together. The illusion was not malicious. It was generous. She spared others the weight of anticipation, choosing to carry it alone. In the 72 hours before her death, the silence grew heavier. Not louder, not dramatic, just denser. She retreated into a smaller circle, conserving energy, preserving privacy. The world outside continued at its usual speed, unaware that something irreversible was unfolding in a quiet house far from the noise of premieres and applause. Whatever symptoms she faced were handled without spectacle, without public framing, without the narrative scaffolding that often accompanies the final chapters of famous lives. She did not allow the machinery of attention to turn her condition into content. In doing so, she denied the public the slow acclimation it expects, the emotional rehearsal that makes loss easier to digest. When the emergency call finally came in the early hours of that January morning, it felt abrupt only because it had been so carefully shielded. The phrase brief illness was not an evasion so much as a boundary. It marked the line she had drawn between her work and her suffering, between what she owed the audience and what she reserved for herself. In a culture that rewards disclosure, she chose opacity. That choice intensified the shock. There was no narrative arc to follow, no gradual descent, only an ending that arrived without warning. The reaction was immediate and raw. Tributes flooded in, not polished statements, but fragmented expressions of disbelief. One voice in particular crystallized the collective regret. A former child co-star, now an adult carrying decades of shared history, admitted publicly what so many felt privately. He thought they had more time. That sentence landed with the weight of a confession. It exposed the central tragedy not as a failure of communication, but as the consequence of trust. Everyone trusted her strength. She trusted their peace. In the space between those two intentions, the opportunity for preparation disappeared. What emerged in the days that followed was not scandal, but recognition. Recognition that endurance has a cost. That professionalism can become camouflage. That silence, while dignified, can also isolate. Colleagues began to speak about her work ethic with a new tone, no longer just admiring but reflective, even uneasy. Stories surfaced of her staying late, of pushing through discomfort, of insisting on getting it right regardless of how she felt. These anecdotes, once celebrated as proof of dedication, now read differently. They suggested a pattern of self-erasure that had gone unquestioned because it produced excellence. The public struggled to reconcile the image they had consumed with the reality they had missed. She had seemed invulnerable because she had never shown the cracks. Her characters were extravagant, loud, indelible. The woman behind them was measured, contained, almost invisible by design. That contrast became painful in hindsight. While audiences replayed scenes and quoted lines, they began to wonder what had been happening in the spaces between performances, in the moments when the wigs came off and the cameras stopped. The industry itself fell uncharacteristically quiet. There were no competing narratives, no rush to reinterpret her life through controversy. The absence of spectacle felt appropriate and unsettling at the same time. It mirrored the way she had lived, present but never intrusive, impactful without demanding attention. The tragedy lay not in what she hid, but in how easily the world accepted the illusion that someone like her would always be fine. In the end, the most devastating element of the recent events was not the illness itself, but the realization of how thoroughly she had protected everyone else from it. She carried the weight privately, believing that her role was to deliver joy, not to complicate it with her own fragility. That belief had shaped her entire career, and it followed her to the very end. When the silence finally broke, it did not reveal scandal or betrayal. It revealed devotion, restraint, and a kind of bravery that asked nothing in return. The aftermath unfolded slowly, not as an explosion of chaos, but as a spreading stillness that settled over everyone she had touched. In the days following her passing, the initial shock gave way to something heavier and more disorienting. It was not just grief for a beloved performer, but a collective reckoning with absence. Sets that once relied on her quiet authority felt strangely unanchored. Conversations stalled where her presence would have guided them forward. Even those who had only known her professionally described an unfamiliar hollowness, as if a stabilizing force had been removed without warning. She had been the kind of figure whose influence was most visible when it disappeared. Her reliability had allowed others to relax, to trust the process, to assume that someone steady was always nearby. When that steadiness vanished, the fragility of the entire structure became impossible to ignore. For those closest to her, the consequences were more intimate and more painful. Grief arrived tangled with regret, not because of unresolved conflict, but because of unasked questions. Family members and longtime collaborators replayed conversations in their minds, searching for moments they might have misunderstood or overlooked. The small pauses, the gentle deflections, the reassuring smiles now carried a different weight. What once felt like grace now felt like concealment. Yet even this realization came with a strange admiration. She had not hidden her struggle out of fear or denial, but out of a lifelong instinct to protect others from discomfort. The burden of that protection, however, did not disappear with her. It transferred. Those left behind were forced to carry the awareness she had refused to share. The industry responded with an uncharacteristic humility. There were tributes and ceremonies, but they felt restrained, almost tentative, as if anything too loud would violate the tone she had set throughout her life. Producers and directors spoke not of box office numbers or awards, but of atmosphere. They described how sets felt calmer when she arrived, how tension dissipated simply because she was there. Younger actors, especially, spoke of her as a quiet anchor, someone who offered reassurance without instruction, support without condescension. Her absence exposed how rare that presence truly was. In an environment built on competition and visibility, she had modeled a different kind of power, one rooted in consistency and emotional intelligence rather than dominance. Public reaction followed a similar pattern. Fans did not respond with outrage or conspiracy, but with confusion and sadness. The lack of details surrounding her final days left many searching for meaning rather than answers. Online spaces filled with shared memories instead of speculation. People wrote about the first time they saw her on screen, about holidays shaped by reruns, about moments of personal hardship softened by laughter she had provided without ever knowing their names. The loss felt personal precisely because she had never asked to be central. She had entered homes quietly, year after year, until her presence felt woven into routine. When she was gone, that routine broke. There were practical consequences as well. Projects she had been attached to were reevaluated, some postponed indefinitely, others quietly shelved. Decisions were made with a level of caution that reflected not just respect, but uncertainty. Her ability to elevate material had often compensated for flaws others did not yet know how to address. Without her, creative gaps became more visible. This was not a criticism of those who remained, but an acknowledgement of how much weight she had been carrying. The loss revealed imbalances that had gone unnoticed because she made things work. Emotionally, the impact extended beyond professional circles. Her death reignited conversations about aging, endurance, and the invisible labor demanded of artists, particularly women. Many saw in her story a familiar pattern, decades of reliability rewarded with admiration but not relief. She had navigated an industry that often sidelines women quietly, and she had done so without bitterness or complaint. That composure, once celebrated, now raised uncomfortable questions. How often do we mistake silence for strength? How often do we reward those who endure by asking them to endure more? For her family, the public mourning created a complicated landscape. They were grieving privately while watching the world process a version of her that was necessarily incomplete. The restraint she had practiced in life now extended into death. There were no dramatic revelations, no final interviews, no explanatory statements. This absence of narrative closure frustrated some, but for those who knew her, it felt consistent. She had never believed that everything needed to be explained. Meaning, to her, emerged through presence, not confession. The challenge for those left behind was learning to accept that some questions would remain unanswered, not because they were ignored, but because she had chosen peace over disclosure. As time passed, the initial shock transformed into a quieter, more enduring sense of loss. It showed up in unexpected places, a line delivered by another actor that did not land the same way, a familiar holiday scene that now carried an edge of finality. The laughter remained, but it was accompanied by an awareness of cost. Viewers began to recognize the discipline beneath the joy, the effort beneath the ease. Her work, once consumed casually, invited deeper appreciation. Each performance felt like evidence of a choice she had made repeatedly to give more than she took. The consequences of her passing were not explosive, but they were profound. They forced a recalibration of how absence is measured, how influence is recognized, how endurance is valued. She had left behind not chaos, but a question that lingered long after the ceremonies ended. If someone so composed, so generous, so quietly strong could disappear without warning, what responsibilities do we have to listen more carefully to those who never asked to be heard? That question did not arrive with resolution. It arrived with weight, and it stayed. There were stories that never reached headlines, moments that existed only in quiet rooms and unguarded hours, fragments of a life carefully lived away from attention. These were not dramatic secrets, but small truths that only gained weight after she was gone. People who had worked beside her for years began to remember details they once dismissed as quirks. How she preferred to arrive early, before the noise of set fully formed, as if she needed a few minutes to orient herself before stepping into character. How she often chose the same chair, the same corner, the same rhythm, creating familiarity in spaces that constantly changed. At the time, it seemed like professionalism. In retrospect, it felt like preparation, a way of conserving energy in a world that demanded constant output. Friends spoke quietly about her reluctance to complain, not in a performative way, not as a badge of honor, but as a deeply ingrained reflex. If something hurt, she adjusted. If something exhausted her, she worked around it. She believed discomfort was something to manage privately, not distribute publicly. That belief shaped countless interactions. When colleagues asked how she was feeling, the answer was always calibrated to reassure. Not dishonest, but incomplete. She would redirect the conversation, ask about their children, their projects, their worries. In doing so, she maintained control of the emotional space. The focus stayed outward. It was a kindness that slowly became a habit. There were moments, however, when the mask thinned. Longtime collaborators recalled brief flashes of candor late at night, after rehearsals ended and the room emptied. She would admit to feeling tired, sometimes profoundly so, but the admission never lingered. It was stated, acknowledged, and then set aside. She did not frame it as suffering. She framed it as logistics, something to be navigated efficiently. Even vulnerability in her hands became organized. Those moments passed quickly, often overshadowed by humor that softened their significance. It was easy to miss what they meant. One recurring pattern emerged in these recollections. She had an instinct to finish what she started, even when it would have been reasonable to stop. Scenes were completed, commitments honored. She resisted last-minute changes that might inconvenience others, even at personal cost. To her, reliability was not just a professional asset. It was a moral position. She believed that people built their expectations around consistency, and breaking the consistency felt like a failure of character. That belief carried her through decades of work, but also narrowed the space in which she allowed herself to be cared for. Family members later described a woman who was deeply present at home, attentive in ways that did not seek recognition. She remembered details, followed routines, created stability that felt almost invisible. There were no grand declarations of love, only actions repeated over time. Cooking, listening, showing up. The same discipline that governed her career shaped her personal life. She did not dramatize emotion. She practiced it. That approach made her a grounding force, but it also meant that warning signs were easy to overlook. Stability can be mistaken for strength without limits. In the months leading up to the end, those closest to her sensed a narrowing of focus. She became more selective with her energy, more protective of her time. Social invitations were declined with warmth, not distance. She framed her absence as choice, not necessity. Those around her respected that framing because it aligned with who she had always been. She had earned the right to retreat, to prioritize, to be less available. What they did not realize was that this retreat carried urgency. The distinction between preference and limitation blurred quietly, without announcement. There were also stories of generosity that surfaced only after her passing. Quiet mentorship offered without credit. Messages sent to younger performers navigating insecurity or doubt. Encouragement delivered privately, never repeated publicly. She understood the fragility of creative confidence and treated it with care. These gestures were not strategic. They were instinctive. She remembered what it felt like to enter rooms where you had to prove your worth repeatedly, and she made a point of easing that burden for others when she could. That generosity did not come from surplus. It came from empathy shaped by experience. Perhaps the most telling accounts involved moments when she almost shared more, then stopped herself. A pause in conversation. A sentence begun and then redirected. Those who witnessed these moments did not press. They assumed discretion was her preference. In truth, it was her defense. To speak openly about vulnerability would have required renegotiating relationships she had spent years stabilizing. It would have shifted the balance from giver to receiver, from anchor to dependent. That shift felt more frightening than silence. After she was gone, these fragments assembled into a fuller picture, not of a hidden scandal or secret drama, but of a sustained effort to remain intact in a system that rewards depletion. Her quiet battles were not fought against any single force, but against accumulation. Fatigue layered over years. Expectation stacked upon expectation. The belief that one more push was always possible. That belief served her until it did not. What makes these stories resonate is their familiarity. Many recognize themselves in her habits. The way care is deferred, the way strength becomes automatic, the way asking for help feels like disruption. Her life reflected a common pattern taken to an extreme by circumstance and success. She had access to resources, support, and admiration, yet she still chose silence. Not because she was alone, but because she was conditioned to endure. These were the stories she never told, not because they were unimportant, but because she did not believe they belonged to the world. In honoring them now, there's a temptation to romanticize her restraint. But the truth is more complicated. Her silence was both a shield and a weight. It preserved dignity while extracting cost. It protected others while isolating her. In understanding that tension, something essential becomes clear. Her legacy is not only in the laughter she gave, but in the reminder that even the most composed lives carry unseen effort, and that kindness toward others does not eliminate the need for care toward oneself. What remains after the silence settles is not simply a catalog of achievements, but a question about value and cost that refuses to fade. Her career stands as proof that longevity is possible without spectacle, that relevance can be earned through precision rather than provocation. Yet her story also exposes the hidden arithmetic behind that success. Every performance carried a fraction of herself away. Every expectation met quietly reinforced the belief that she could keep going without pause. The industry praised her discipline. Audiences rewarded her consistency. And somewhere along the way, endurance became indistinguishable from obligation. That is the paradox at the heart of her legacy. She showed the world how to age with grace on screen while privately absorbing the pressure to never appear diminished. Her work, when viewed now, carries a different texture. Scenes once played for laughter reveal layers of intention and control that feel almost architectural. Timing that seemed effortless reads as carefully measured. Emotional beats land with a clarity that suggests deep awareness of how much weight humor can carry. She understood comedy as a form of caretaking, a way to regulate emotion not just for herself but for others. That understanding shaped everything she touched. It also explains why she guarded her own vulnerability so closely. To reveal, it would have disrupted the role she believed she needed to fulfill, the one who steadied the room. The lesson many draw from her life is not that silence is noble, but that it is seductive. It allows strength to be admired without being questioned. It permits systems to benefit from reliability without offering relief. In celebrating her composure, the industry inadvertently normalized a model of success that demands continuous output and minimal need. Her passing forces a reassessment of that model. It invites a conversation about what we ask of those who give us joy and what we fail to notice when they comply without complaint. The absence she left behind has become a mirror, reflecting patterns that extend far beyond one individual. There is also something enduring in the way she resisted being defined by suffering. She did not allow illness or fatigue to eclipse her identity. She chose to be remembered for what she created rather than what she endured. That choice deserves respect. At the same time, it complicates the narrative we inherit. We are left holding both admiration and unease. Admiration for her discipline and generosity. Unease about the costs of a life lived in constant service to expectation. Her legacy lives in that tension, not as a cautionary tale, but as an invitation to think more carefully about balance. For younger performers, her path offers a complex blueprint. It demonstrates that craft matters, that consistency builds trust, that integrity can sustain a career longer than controversy ever will. But it also warns that invisibility can be mistaken for ease, that being dependable can quietly erase the need to ask how someone is actually doing. Her story encourages a redefinition of strength, one that includes rest, transparency, and the permission to be human without apology. That redefinition may be the most meaningful inheritance she leaves behind. As audiences return to her work, there is a subtle shift in how it is received. Laughter still arrives, but it is accompanied by awareness. Each performance feels like a gift offered deliberately, not casually. The recognition of effort does not diminish enjoyment. If anything, it deepens it. Understanding the care she put into every moment allows viewers to meet her work with equal care. This reciprocal attention transforms entertainment into exchange. It honors not just what she gave, but how she gave it. Her life also reframes the concept of legacy itself. Legacy is often measured in accolades, influence, and cultural footprint. By those metrics, her impact is undeniable. Yet there is another dimension that matters just as much: the quiet ways she shaped environments, supported colleagues, and modeled professionalism without spectacle. These contributions resist quantification, but they persist in the habits and standards of those she worked with. They ripple outward, influencing choices and behaviors long after her presence is gone. That is a form of legacy that does not announce itself, but it endures. In the end, her story leaves us with a responsibility rather than a conclusion. It challenges us to listen more closely, to question assumptions about resilience, to notice the difference between silence chosen for dignity and silence adopted out of necessity. It asks whether we can appreciate excellence without demanding endless availability, whether we can admire composure while still making space for care. These questions do not resolve neatly. They linger, much like the memory of her work, inviting reflection rather than closure. Her laughter remains woven into the culture, replayed and reinterpreted by new audiences who may never know the full context of her final years. That is not a failure of understanding, but a continuation of her choice. She wanted the work to speak, to outlast the circumstances of its creation. In honoring that wish, we do not ignore the cost. We acknowledge it quietly, with the same restraint she practiced, and allow it to inform how we engage with those who continue to give us joy. The story closes not with noise, but with a pause that asks something of the people left behind. When the tributes fade and routines slowly resume, what lingers is not a list of roles or awards, but a feeling that something essential has shifted. Her absence reframes familiar scenes, turning laughter into something layered, warm but edged with awareness. We return to those moments not because we need escape, but because they remind us how generosity can exist without demand, how presence can be offered without spectacle. In watching her work now, there's a sense of conversation continuing across time, as if each performance is asking whether we noticed how carefully it was given. That question does not accuse. It invites reflection. She did not leave behind a manifesto or a final explanation. What she left instead was an example shaped by restraint. She showed that it is possible to build a life of meaning without turning every struggle into a headline, without insisting that pain be witnessed to be valid. Yet the quiet dignity of that choice carries a responsibility for those who observe it. Silence can be respected without being romanticized. Strength can be admired without being exploited. Her life encourages a more attentive form of appreciation, one that recognizes effort even when it is hidden, one that asks not only what someone produces, but what it costs them to produce it. For many, the finality of her passing sharpened an awareness that had always hovered just out of reach. We assume time because we want to. We trust continuity because it feels safer than uncertainty. Her story disrupts that comfort gently but firmly. It reminds us that presence is not guaranteed, even when it feels habitual. The familiar can disappear without warning, leaving behind gratitude mixed with regret. That mixture is uncomfortable, but it is also honest. It pushes us to be more deliberate with attention, more generous with patience, more willing to check in rather than assume everything is fine. The legacy she leaves is not fragile. It does not depend on constant reinterpretation or defense. It lives in repetition, in the way her work continues to find new audiences, in the way lines are quoted, scenes replayed, expressions remembered. But alongside that cultural endurance sits a quieter inheritance. It is the permission to reconsider how we define success and care. To ask whether admiration can coexist with concern, whether professionalism can make room for vulnerability, whether kindness toward others can be matched with kindness toward oneself. These are not abstract questions. They are practical ones, relevant far beyond the world she inhabited. As viewers, listeners, and participants in shared culture, we are implicated in the answers. We decide what behavior we reward, what silence we accept, what strength we expect. Her story asks us to slow down that decision-making, to resist the reflex to consume joy without curiosity about its source. It encourages a gentler form of engagement, one that values sustainability over spectacle. That shift may be subtle, but it matters. It changes how we show up for the people whose work shapes our lives, and how we show up for one another. There is also comfort in recognizing that she did not leave unfinished work in the way we often fear. She completed what she chose to complete. She exited on her own terms, consistent with the way she lived. The grief that followed speaks not to neglect, but to attachment. People mourn because they felt accompanied, because her presence had quietly become part of their emotional landscape. That kind of connection does not require explanation. It simply exists, and when it is gone, it is felt everywhere at once. In the end, the question her story leaves behind is not why she left, but how we listen while people are still here. Do we hear the pauses as clearly as the punchlines? Do we notice the discipline beneath the ease? Do we create spaces where honesty is met with care rather than inconvenience? These are questions without definitive answers, but they are worth carrying forward. They shape how loss is transformed into learning rather than nostalgia alone. Her laughter will continue to echo, not because it demands attention, but because it earned trust. That trust now becomes something we can extend outward to others whose struggles may be quieter, whose strength may look like composure, whose generosity may be mistaken for inexhaustibility. In that sense, her final gift is ongoing. It lives in the awareness she leaves behind, in the conversations that follow, in the moments when we choose to look a little closer. If her story moved you, unsettled you, or reminded you of someone you care about, that response matters. Share what stayed with you. Say the thing you might otherwise leave unsaid. In doing so, the silence she left does not remain empty. It becomes a space for listening, reflection, and connection.